Good evening, virtual visitors. My name is Shakia Gillette. I'm the director of the African American History Initiative here at the Missouri Historical Society. Welcome to our program and thank you for joining us tonight. Before we get started, we would like to thank our members, donors, and supporters of the Zoo Museum Tax District. As a part of our long tradition of working actively toward racial equity and our commitment to improving and diversifying the historical perspective, we are proud to present to you the second keynote presentation of our How Did We Get Here? Conversations about Race, Anti-Blackness, and Identity series. Many people have referred to the current climate as the Summer of Awakening. And in many ways, this entire series is designed to awaken and provoke you to see history in a different light. As the Missouri Historical Society, it is our job to provide historical perspectives on timely issues and cross historic, economic, and racial divides in order to tell the stories of everyone who calls the St. Louis region home. I want to first applaud each of you for participating in this discussion. Tonight's presentation may feel uncomfortable at times, but it is important to create a space where dialogue and deep discussion may happen. We acknowledge that each of you have different vantage points based on your lived experience, but please utilize this time to listen to different perspectives and gain knowledge. It is our job to bring provocative voices to the forefront. And in addition to focusing on national events, we want to be sure to highlight various aspects of local history. We are honored to host this program and grateful to our guest panelists for sharing their views with us this evening. Tonight's program will run for about 90 minutes, which includes a presentation, a short documentary clip, a moderated discussion, and a 15-minute Q&A. For your listening pleasure, we ask that you use your headsets to optimize the volume capacity during the film snippet. We would also like to thank Nine Network for their support and allowing us to use Of Black and Blue, the journey of African American police during this program. For your convenience, you can submit questions through the Q&A button in your toolbar. And in order to streamline the process, we would prefer for you to wait until the end to ask your questions. Please know that we will do our very best to answer all of your questions, but we may not have time to get to everyone. So at this time, I'm going to introduce our guest presenters and kick off our program. William H. Freivogel is a professor and former director of the School of Journalism at Southern Illinois University and publisher of the Gateway Journalism Review. He worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for 34 years, serving as assistant Washington bureau chief and deputy editorial editor. Editorials about civil liberties abuses by Attorney General John Ashcroft were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2002. He won the ABA's Silver Gavel Award in 2016 for legal analysis written for the St. Louis Public Radio about the death of Michael Brown. Representative Alan K. Green represents parts of St. Louis County, District 67, in the Missouri House of Representatives. He was elected in a special election in August 2014. He is an assistant minister at the Worship Center Church, which he handles the senior ministry. Mr. Green served as special assistant to the director of the Department of Social Service for the state of Missouri. Green has taught courses at St. Louis Community College as an adjunct professor in criminal justice administration. He has also served as a St. Louis police officer. He designed programs for the WAR program for grade school, middle school, and high school students related to drugs and alcohol. He wrote and co-produced the film, The History of Black Police Officers in St. Louis, wrote and produced the film, We Are Responsible. which was nominated for a local Gallup Oscar Award. Alan K. Green graduated from the University of Texas at Tyler with a BS in Criminal Justice and American Diplomacy, an MBA from Lindenwood University, and a PhD from the United Theological Seminary. Roger L. Goldman is the nation's foremost expert on police licensing and license revocation laws. For more than 2 decades, he has been helping states write and adopt laws that provide for removing the license or certificate of an officer who engages in serious misconduct such as sexual assault and brutality. Educated at Harvard College and the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Professor Goldman is also a leading expert on the US Supreme Court and constitutional law, In addition to his many articles on police licensing, he is an author of 3 books on the US Supreme Court, the role of the Supreme Court in protecting civil rights and liberties, Justice William J. Brennan, Jr., Freedom First, and Thurgood Marshall, Justice for All, which was a finalist for the 1992 NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Literary Work. Sergeant Donnell Walters has over an 18-year law enforcement career and is currently assigned to the Community Engagement Recruiting Unit. He holds a bachelor's degree in operational security management and is known as a de-escalation subject matter expert in the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. Walters is a national defense tactics instructor, a firearms instructor, and a St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department crisis negotiation team leader. Please welcome our guest panelists to tonight's program. Okay, and at this time, I am going to turn the floor over to our moderator for the evening, Mr. Bill Freivogel.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Good evening and welcome to everyone out there. In a few minutes, you'll be watching part of the 9 Network documentary of Black and Blue. You'll hear Gwen Moore of the Missouri Historical Society talking about the origins of the St. Louis Police Department, going back to 1808, when one of their functions was to serve as slave patrols. It was the St. Louis Police Department that arrested Francis McIntosh for disturbing the peace on April 28th, 1836. McIntosh was a mulatto cook on the steamboat Flora that was passing by the riverfront. When a policeman told him he would spend 5 years in jail for disturbing the peace, he stabbed one officer to death and seriously injured another. He escaped, but a mob found him hiding in an outhouse. The mob, which grew to several hundred people, chained him to a tree near 7th and Chestnut, piled wood up to his knees and burned him to death as he pleaded for them to shoot him instead. The murder was 1 block from where the bucolic City Garden Sculpture Park now stands. A grand jury investigated the lynching. The judge's name was Luke Lawless, which was an appropriate name as it turned out. Judge Lawless said McIntosh was an example of the, quote, atrocities committed in this and other states by individuals of Negro blood against their white brethren. And he added, the free Negro has been converted into a deadly enemy. And he said that conversion had occurred because of abolitionists like Elijah Lovejoy, who had influenced McIntosh. Well, that wasn't true. But a week later, Lovejoy, who was an abolitionist newspaper editor in St. Louis at the time, editorialized that the lynching meant the end of the rule of law. Only one lawmaker in Missouri or Illinois condemned the lynching. His name, by the way, was Abraham Lincoln. After Lovejoy's May editorial, a mob of toughs from the downtown taverns destroyed Lovejoy's press and threw parts of it in the Mississippi. Lovejoy moved across the river to Alton, which was officially a free state, although it was the home to slave catchers looking to catch slaves who had escaped from Missouri. In November 8, 1937, about a year after McIntosh was lynched, a mob burned his warehouse, murdered Lovejoy, and his press was thrown out of the warehouse and onto the riverbank where it was broken. The Civil War was influential in the state taking over governance of the St. Louis Police Department. The reason was St. Louis was more pro-union than the rest of the state, and the state's pro-slavery governor moved for the state to take over the department's control. Alan Wagner, who was an UMSL professor who wrote about the history of the St. Louis Police Department, noted that Governor Claiborne Jackson made it clear that the state was taking over to help the South. Jackson said, Missouri will not be found to shrink from the duty of her position upon the border imposes on her interests and her sympathies point alike in the direction and determine her stand with the South. Bob Archibald, who used to be head of the Historical Society, put it this way: the St. Louis Police Department constituted the largest quasi-military organization in the state, and the police bill was a Civil War measure passed by people who wanted to control it as part of the Civil War. Alan Green, who you've just met as part of our panel, will recount to you a little bit later on in the Black and Blue documentary, the stories of some of the first Black officers in the early 20th century, including 3 officers who weren't allowed to wear a uniform and could only arrest Black citizens. And tonight, then, he'll go on to tell you about Ira Cooper, a Black officer from the 1920s who solved a burglary scheme at Mercantile Bank that had stumped Scotland Yard. For me, the modern era of the police department began with Theodore McNeil, the first Black police board president. He was appointed by Kit Bond in 1971. Of course, Kit Bond was a Republican governor. The board president may have been Black, but African Americans were still struggling to get hired and promoted in the St. Louis Police Department as they were elsewhere in the country. Consent decrees in a number of states requiring one-to-one hiring and promotion addressed this problem in many American cities. The biggest increase in African Americans in the police department, St. Louis Police Department, occurred during the 1980s, as Representative Green will note. But it didn't take long for the Supreme Court to end progress in these various consent decrees, and with a 1989 regressive decision involving the Birmingham Fire Department. But back to Ted McNeil, the first Black board president in the early 1970s. O'Neill could be very candid. As a young reporter, and I was only 1 year into my time as a journalist, I interviewed him, and he told me that police officers had probably killed Joseph Wilson, who was a white man who had been arrested in the 3rd District and found dead in a holding cell. I can remember Daniel Bartlett, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, and Brendan Ryan, the circuit attorney, telling me that they could make out the imprint of a shoe on Wilson's rib cage, but there was no prosecution. And the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, the other newspaper at the time, editorialized, it couldn't be true that the police had stomped him to death. Mike Royko, you may remember, as a very funny columnist from Chicago, made fun of the police story, saying Wilson must have fallen off the tallest bar stool in the world. About the same time, 1972, Michael Mattis, the 18-year-old son of a prominent St. Louis County doctor, Robert Mattis, was killed by an Olivet police officer as he and his teenage accomplice fled a burglary at a golf driving range. The ACLU here challenged the use of deadly force to arrest a fleeing suspect. They ended up losing that case, but eventually in a Memphis case that went to the Supreme Court about a decade and a half later, the Supreme Court agreed police couldn't use deadly force just to arrest a fleeing suspect who wasn't dangerous. On January 8th, 1977, Thomas Brown, a young man with severe mental problems, was shot to death in the Maplewood police station after having been arrested on a charge of trying to cash a stolen money order. It turned out the Maplewood police had a reputation for forcing prisoners to play Russian roulette in the police station. A man arrested along with Brown testified that Patrolman Kenneth Poole emptied the bullets from his pistol except for one and forced Brown to choose a number. Brown chose 1. Poole pointed the gun at Brown according to court testimony, and fired, killing him point blank. Roger Goldman, who you've just met as another panelist tonight, was a neighbor of mine at the time. And he noticed a couple of years later that Joseph Sorbello, who was a Maplewood police officer forced out after the Brown killing, that Joseph Sorbello, who also had a reputation for playing Russian roulette with prisoners, had been hired after being forced out of Maplewood by another St. Louis County municipality. And then he had shot a suspect, I think, who was trying to steal a car. Roger realized that the jurisdiction hopping was where bad cops left one jurisdiction and went on to behave badly in another jurisdiction was a big problem. And this began his crusade to enact the police officers' standards and training regimen passed in Missouri in 1988 to decertify bad cops. Most states now have decertification processes, but they're full of loopholes, and wandering officers, as they're sometimes referred to, still can leave one department and get to a job at another. St. Anne has developed a reputation in recent years for hiring officers forced out of the St. Louis department. Yeah, and most recently, an officer that St. Anne hired was one of the officers who shot Milton Green a few years ago in St. Louis. Goldman will tell us about the decertification crusade later tonight, as well as the state law passed in 2000 to deter racial profiling. Unfortunately, the latest statistics, racial profiling statistics, don't show a whole lot of improvement. By the 90s, Clarence Harmon became the first Black chief and later the mayor. Harmon recalled feeling the pressure was on, that people were looking at him to see if he was going to measure up. He also recalled that most of the police officers forced out of the St. Louis Police Department for misbehavior ended up in small suburban departments. After Harmon came Ron Henderson, Dan Isom, and now John Hayden, making 4 African-American chiefs. This decade's history of policing in St. Louis is seared into every St. Louisan's memory. Michael Brown, Darren Wilson, Jason Stockley, the police department's illegal use of kettling, the beating of Luther Hall by 3 white colleagues, the St. Louis Police Officers Association's racial attack on the first Black prosecutor, the union's defense of 55+ officers found to have lied in court or posted racist slurs on social media. If you doubt the relevance of race to policing and criminal justice in 2020, take a look at Circuit Attorney Kim Gardner's lawsuit filed earlier this year under the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Gardner contends elements of the white police union and the white legal establishment have set up the trappings of a legitimate criminal investigation to punish her for her Eric Greitens prosecution. She says the true purpose is to thwart and impede her efforts to establish the equal treatment under law for all St. Louis citizens and to send a message about what happens to Black circuit attorneys when they dare to stand up for equal rights for racial minorities. Take a look at the different responses from the police groups in St. Louis. Jeff Rorda's Police Officers Association said this about Gardner, quote, "This is a prosecutor who declared war on crime victims and the police officers sworn to protect them. She turns murderers and other violent criminals loose to prey on St. Louis's most vulnerable citizens and has time and again falsely accused police of wrongdoing. The streets of the city have become killing fields as a direct result of Gardner's actions and inactions." Meanwhile, the Ethical Society of Police disagreed. They said, quote, "We have repeatedly highlighted the disparities along racial lines with discipline, promotions, and job placement. Therefore, the circuit attorney stating that she experienced racial bias at the hands of some of the late St. Louis Metropolitan Police officers is far from meritless." Sergeant Donnell Walters, our other panelist tonight, was one of those involved in some of the changes that followed Ferguson. There have been some real pluses in what has happened since then. Senate Bill 5, reform of the municipal courts, the Ferguson consent decree, forward through Ferguson, the bail project, and more recently, the plans to close the workhouse. Sergeant Donnell was put in charge, Sergeant Walters was put in charge of developing training for de-escalation to avoid situations like Michael Brown and Tamir Rice killings. The Forward Through Ferguson report quotes Walters as saying, when he got the assignment, "What's de-escalation? What am I supposed to teach?" He was told, "Don't worry, you'll come up with it." So he Googled it, and he did a great job. Forward Through Ferguson concluded Sergeant Walters had worked hard to build that training, and it was well received. Now let's turn to the snippet from 9 Network's Black and Blue, and then we'll turn to Alan Green to learn about the early 20th century African-American officers of the St. Louis Department. As you can see, we're not getting the sound that we had hoped to get from the video. So I think we'll go straight to Alan Green. Alan, your part of the video is you talking about some of the officers in the early 20th century. So maybe you can fill us in on that, and then move on to that interesting story about the mercantile burglaries.
Yeah, before I get to the story with Ira Cooper, I just wanted to talk about of Black and Blue here, because how this particular project came about. Went to PBS because 30 years ago, had the chance to host and produce the history of Black police officers in St. Louis, but there was a gap there of over 30 years of video that was left behind. So I approached PBS about, again, a second part of the history of Black police officers in St. Louis. And we went through about 3 or 4 legal sheets of just ideas of what we could come up with. And then we invited many different officers to come in, and I got on the phone and called various retirees as well as officers to come in and talk about their discussion of being a police officer in the city of St. Louis, as well as St. Louis County. And then, of course, the project was assigned to Ruth Ezell, and that is the project that you see before you. Very proud of that particular project. Again, it took 30 years in the works. It was like birthing a baby right there. So very proud to see that piece that's out there in the community right now. What you're seeing right now is actually that is the command group that Ira Cooper, and let me tell you about Ira Cooper, but before that, as history goes, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, St. Louis Police Department decided to hire 2 officers. And those particular officers were hired by the City of St. Louis Police Department, Metropolitan Police Department. And they, again, were assigned different patrol areas, but they had no uniforms. They were given, or actually wore their suits to work. They were, again, assigned no arrest powers, and they were actually like detectives immediately right out of the gate, which is unheard of. So they were brought on, and they could not arrest whites, but they were assigned to the African American community. The third officer that was brought on in that period of time was Ira Cooper. Now, Ira Cooper was very special in itself because he brought skills, a lot of skills to the table. Even though he couldn't wear a uniform, and of course he was a detective immediately too, being the third one, he brought something special and very rare, a college education to the St. Louis Police Department, being an African American male, and that was special in itself. Now, let me tell you a little bit about more about Ira Cooper. And Ira Cooper, when he was brought on, uh, he had these particular skills, but before he arrived, he had went to school. He studied to become an optometrist. He put a shingle out into the community, and he tried his best to again gear up and run an office, but he couldn't. He wasn't successful. So a friend of his asked him if he wanted to be a St. Louis police officer. That was a salary there. He thought about it, and after thinking about it, he decided, yes, I would do that. And he became a St. Louis police officer. And so he put behind that educational piece of being an optometrist and became a St. Louis police officer. Now, one of the good things is about Ira Cooper is he brought all that intelligence with him. And so he was, of course, assigned to the African American portion of the bureaus there, just like with the other two, but he grew. Ira Cooper was the first sergeant in the minority sergeant within the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. He was also the first African American lieutenant within the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. But let's talk about some of his successes. The Mercantile Bank. Well, there was a case of suspicion of money disappearing within the Mercantile Bank, and no one could figure out. They brought in the Pinkertons. They brought in again the English police officers, and they were, trying to figure out. They brought in some of the top police officers, of course, in St. Louis City, and no one could figure out how this money was disappearing within the Mercantile Bank. And then all of a sudden, because they couldn't figure it out and a couple of years had passed, they asked Ira Cooper to take a look at this particular theft that was going on. And so Ira Cooper sat back for a while and started examining the bank inside and outside, trying to figure out, of course, the method of how the money was disappearing. And then slowly he started looking at the staff that was there. And he looked at the cleaning crews at night that would come in, and they were all African American cleaning crews. And what he found is that on a particular event that always occurred was that when large sums of money would come in, it seems like some of the money would disappear, but they couldn't figure out how it was going on. And what was strange about all of that in itself is that there was one particular individual that was on the cleaning crew, and he had figured out that on those particular days when large sums of money would come, he would make a phone call to his cousin in Chicago. And he would call and he says, "Bacon is here, come to St. Louis." And his cousin would arrive, and he was good with books, and he would get in on the cleaning crew. And at that time, they had cages in the bank. He would climb over the cage. He would use a pencil, because that's how they kept up with the data then. He would erase some of the numbers, put new numbers in, and he would remove the cash, and no one could figure out that the books were being changed. No one. Ira Cooper figured it out, but what they couldn't figure out, all the other officers at the particular time, is that an African American was smart enough to change the books. In their wildest dreams, no one could conceive that, but Ira Cooper did. And that's how those gentlemen ended up getting caught and arrested for stealing money out of the Mercantile Bank. No one, Scotland Yard, like I said, could not figure out. The Pinkertons could not figure it out. The Queen of England, after she, of course, heard about how he solved that case, invited Ira Cooper to come over to England. He met with the Queen, and she gave him a kiss on the cheeks. And that is one of those stories in itself that's just unbelievable. But those are part of the things. When Ira Cooper, of course, was then promoted sergeant, he was a command, which is the screen in front of you, of an all-black platoon. The black platoon was not able to drive in police cars. They were all foot patrolmen. And as you notice with his platoon later, they have uniforms. So they progressed from wearing suits, being detectives, to now having uniforms, which was, again, now moving more toward the modern times. When he finally passed on, he was a lieutenant. And this is, again, the squad that he was patrolled of. It took 30 years after his death, 30 years before there was ever another Black lieutenant within the Metropolitan Police Department, 30 years later. So that is some of the history, and we can go into the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but I really want to zero in on Ira Cooper there and some of the history and some of the successes that he had.
Well, Alan, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit. Why don't you take it into the a little bit more up to date, and then we'll let Donnie take over from where you leave off. Does that make sense?
Sure, I can keep going.
Yeah, tell us about the 60s, 70s, and that's when you were there as an officer. Am I correct? In the 80s. Okay.
I was in the 80s. I'm not that old to be in there.
Sorry.
I know I got a lot of gray, but okay. But going back to the 50s again, it was 30 years after when Lieutenant Ira Cooper passed. And then you had, of course, sergeants, and then you had patrolmen that eventually got a chance to be in patrol cars. But what you also see within the 60s, the 70s, and now going into the 80s, is that when I arrived, actually in the 80s, of 1,300 police officers, there was only 300 African-American police officers on the Metropolitan Police Department out of 1,300. As you can see, that number was not very, very large. Another thing that you would see too, when you go back into the history of all those years right there, is that we still, going back into the 80s and now into the 90s, we still had officers that had challenges becoming detectives. You had challenges going into the special bureaus. You had challenges going to the FBI Academy and also getting promoted again. Now we're talking about all these years have progressed, and now we're still having challenges becoming sergeants, lieutenants, captains, and now majors and lieutenant colonels. And all of that went up to that time period right there. Yes, we've had, and I heard that too, we've had some chiefs now. We've had some deputy chiefs. We had some lieutenant colonels, but it was a long time coming, a long time coming. And one of the things that you'll see too is that there's still some gaps that's in there, but things have now started to progress. But African-American numbers, you'll see that the numbers are still not very high within the ranks of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. We still don't have a lot of minorities on the department. All right.
Thanks. Donnie, can you pick up with when you went on the department?
I came on the department roughly 18 years ago, and currently, I apologize on my bio being so short, is that right now I am sitting on the board of the Ethical Society of Police, which was founded back in 1972. And I'm sure Alan knows all about it, and it had something to do with that lack of promotions and the lack of African-American police officers being recognized as a part of the department, should I say. So, and here recently, I guess 2018, we've actually extended to the St. Louis County PD. So we're growing, and I believe it's just a lot of this is just the evolution and growing, you know, and hearing that story about Ira Cooper and how we've evolved and we're steady evolving. Where with the Ethical Society Police, it's all about dealing with the race-based discrimination within not only the SLMPD or departments, but also in the community. You know, that's part of our mission, is to bridge the gap between police departments and the community, because we find that that's a huge gap. When I created the de-escalation program, as you know, William, you kind of hinted to, and yes, they did use that quote, as at the beginning I had no idea which way to go, but since then I have grown the program in so many different variations to where it's de-escalation through communication. You know, how do we talk to people? And when I say we, I'm saying those of us in law enforcement. It's a way that we talk to people. Sometimes we have to drop the jargon and address people as people. as well as address each other in law enforcement as people. You know, where the Ethical Society is about seekers of justice and accountability for all. And that is another thing that we strive on, along with, again, working with the community to improve St. Louis as a whole, not only just the city, but the county as well.
So how much of the training of a police officer these days is involved with de-escalation and how to reach out to the community and do community policing?
Well, they get a block of instruction in the academy, as well as different things come about. I have been tasked with from several commanders to create ongoing programs to address and reinforce. Again, when I initially started the program, it was a de-escalation, I guess you could say, overview. Then it became a de-escalating through communication. Then I created a de-escalating from the job, because sometimes we in law enforcement, when the job is over, at the end of the day, some officers do not know how to decompress and de-escalate from the job. You know, this is one of those professions where you wear the job to work as well as wearing the job home. You know, and so I help even with dealing with some of the stressors that we deal with, and I term it dumping your pot. As in law enforcement for 18 years, I've seen a lot. I've encountered a lot, in addition to my personal life. So at some point, I have to dump that pot and talk to someone to get the stressors and to release those tensions that you may have internally. And sometimes we forget as law enforcement to do that.
Roger, let's move to you. Tell us about your personal crusade to bring decertification to the nation.
Well, and about to the nation, let me go back to Bill, your introduction about how I got interested in this topic. And it was a situation where this Maplewood lieutenant had, what should we say, unusual ways of getting confessions. In addition to playing Russian roulette with suspects, he would sometimes put his service revolver into the mouth of the suspect and say, "Suck on it." And sometimes that worked with a confession. And in the case with Russian roulette, apparently the patrolman who worked under him, he was Lieutenant Sorbello, had witnessed one of his Russian roulette situations, and they, not in his presence, they imitated it and they killed this mentally challenged suspect that you mentioned. The surprising thing was that even though it was well known, because it was a story in the Post-Dispatch almost every day about this out of control Maplewood Police Department, the chief in Bridgeton Terrace knew about Sorbello's conduct back at Maplewood, nonetheless hired him as part-time. And that's when I went to the local ACLU and talked to Clarence Harmon, who was head of internal affairs, and said, we need to do something about it, because how in the world could you have, could we allow someone, just because he graduated from the police academy, to do something that terrible, playing Russian roulette, and be rehired? And it was the bill we put together with Sheila Lumpy. Those of you who might remember her, a great state representative from U City. She put together a bill signed by Governor John Ashcroft. In 1988, that bill was passed by the legislature. And so we had one of the best decertification laws in the country. I just checked with the Post, they're part of the Department of Public Safety, and we have decertified in Missouri 1,000 officers since 1988. And my guess is most of the viewers tonight will be unaware it even exists, this process, which means if you have had your license stripped, just like if you lost it as a doctor or a lawyer, you cannot serve in law enforcement in the state of Missouri again. And since then, I've worked in several other states, and especially with the death of George Floyd, there has been tremendous interest. And when I started in this back in the 70s, 15 states had decertification or license revocation. And today all but 5 have it. And the states that don't have it are Massachusetts, Hawaii, California, Rhode Island, New Jersey, very blue states, with typically police unions will oppose this very sensible decertification procedure. But I'm fairly confident by the end of the year, because a bunch of those other states are now considering it, that every state in the union will soon have this ability to stop this movement of officers. They're called wandering officers. They go from one department to another. As Clarence Harmon said in his testimony back in that 1988 bill, that in 90% of the cases when a St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department officer was resigned under fire or was fired, he'd be working in a county department within a matter of a week. So it's not that it doesn't still happen. You mentioned the St. Anne case, but we're so much better off now than we were. And now I think there's going to be a national effort so that every state will have this ability to decertify. Let me add one other thing, Bill. There is a data bank that keeps track of these decertified officers. So if you're decertified in Missouri and you wanted to go to Florida, there's this data bank that the police agencies would have, and they'd be able to check to see if this person would be decertified in another state.
But Roger, do they regularly check that database?
So it's up to each department or each state whether to do it. And there's sort of an uneven enforcement, which is why I recommended to the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, which they adopted, that the Department of Justice ought to get involved in operating this data bank with this group that operates it. It's a national association of the heads of the state post agencies. And in the recent reform bill, some of the, at the federal level, have been talking about having a national database. We have it for healthcare professionals. And as I like to say, if we have it for docs, why not for cops?
Do you want to talk a bit about racial profiling statistics as well?
Yeah, well, on the racial profiling, some of you may know that in 2000, a bill was introduced, again, backed by the local ACLU, that requires municipalities to report to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General comes out with a list what the racial composition is in the stops that police departments are making. There's been an attempt by the Attorney General Schmidt to add to that, but there is this annual report. My sense is that it's just a report. I'm not sure any action is taken, but we were one of the first states to get this racial profiling bill through. Many other states have now copied that.
You know, I noticed that there is a question that was posed by one of our persons in the audience who asks of you, Roger, do you have any examples of the kind of offenses officers have been decertified for, and what's the process of decertification of officers?
Okay, Missouri has a fairly broad definition of what constitutes a decertifiable offense. In some states, you actually have to be convicted of a crime, which in my sense is way too narrow. Think of any other licensed occupation. Only if a lawyer is convicted of a crime will he be decertified or lose his license. So in Missouri, it's if you've committed an act, not necessarily been convicted of that involves moral turpitude. So that might be sexual misconduct, fraud, theft. You don't have to be convicted of a crime, and then you can lose the license. And as I said, Missouri's had 1,000 such decertifications in a fairly short period of time. The process is you go to a hearing before an administrative hearing officer that's works for the state, and then if the hearing officer finds that your conduct meets the definition of, say, moral turpitude, another one is committing a crime, then that hearing officer says you violated the statute, and then the head of the Department of Public Safety determines what the sanction should be. It could be license revocation, probation, suspension, but it varies all over the country in terms of what that process is. But in Missouri, 1,000 officers have in effect been decertified since 1988, which puts us probably in the top 10% in the country.
Alan and Donnie, I'd like to go back to you and talk a little bit about, can you explain what kind of relationship exists between your ethical organization and Jeff Rorta's Police Officers Association. How, you certainly have different views on Kim Gardner.
Yeah, yes, and that's true. There has been things that has been said by Jeff Rorter in regards to the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, but he does not represent the department as a whole. I will go on record and say he does not represent me. I am not part of the association. So therefore, he does not represent me when he speaks on law enforcement type of platforms, should I say. And that's one thing that we as the Ethical Society strive at, is we listen to the facts and everything of that nature, regardless of personal feelings about a person's performance. You still you don't attack a person and the sense of racial discrimination, should I say. So with his spewing of certain things, we kind of, we prefer to come with facts instead of fiction. And, you know, we take we're always professional. Let me say it that way. We're always professional in our responses to anything, whether it's addressing anything concerning the actions of the chief, whether it's concerning anything of our superiors. We're professional at the end of the day.
What percentage of Black members of the police department are in the Police Officers Association?
I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but we do have members that hold dual membership. Once upon a time, I held a dual membership.
Can I jump
Go
in
ahead,
on that?
Alan. Yeah.
Because he had also mentioned too, you have now St. Louis County and St. Louis City as part of the Ethical Society. And there was a need in St. Louis County, especially for the minority officers, to also have representation. So now you have that in St. Louis County as well as St. Louis City. I know we're not talking a lot about St. Louis County and some of the disparities that happens out in the county too, but there's quite a bit that happens in the St. Louis County Police Department too. And so the Ethical Society now bridges that gap that wasn't there before. And so you have the Police Officers Association, of course, that represents, as they say, the majority of quote unquote of the officers, but there still was a gap that was there. And so I just wanted to point that out. I don't care if you look at St. Louis City or St. Louis County, there was a gap.
You know, Alan, yesterday we were talking about what kinds of qualifications should a police officer have? I mean, should there be some kind of educational qualification that is required? I think you have some thoughts on that.
Yes, I do. I'll be honest, when I came on back in the 80s, I came on with a master's degree and people kept telling me I was overqualified. Now we look at 2020 and we need to re-examine that, because in the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, you can come on with a high school education. I'm saying there's nothing wrong with that. And traditionally, in looking at all this history, that's actually how many different ethnic groups became and got into the middle class. You can go from the Irish to actually a period of time with the Jewish, and you can now look at the African Americans. It helps you take that foot up. But now with all the protests and reevaluating where we're at, maybe we need to look at, maybe the officers do need to have more training, more education when they come on. St. Louis County, it takes 64 hours when you come on to St. Louis County Police Department. I'm not saying that that is, but what we should look at is the criteria, even social work. A lot of the situations that police officers deal with are in that area. Social services are in where, when we look at their training, are they trained in that area? And many times, no, because when a lot of officers, when they come on, they will tell you, I came on to basically enforce the law. And a lot of guys will say that. I came in to enforce the law. But there's a whole nother spectrum of policies that go along with that. especially in the community when you pull up and, there's a marriage disturbance that's going on, husband and wife. How do you handle those situations? When there's someone mentally ill, how do you handle those situations? A lot of time police officers feel, lock them up, let the judge decide, instead of, again, taking that extra effort and that extra time to figure out. There are officers that do that, don't get me wrong, and there are a lot of wonderful officers, but I truly think that we should have more educational piece and have perks in there that officers get their associate's degrees. We do have some of that too, because you get pay raises to go along with that. Get your bachelor's degrees, get your master's degrees, and that's how a lot of the guys get promoted and they move on with their careers. But nobody really talks about that area of social work. And a lot of officers shun away from that because a lot of them don't want to be qualified as saying, I am a social worker or I'm attached to social work. That's a stigma in our community, especially in law enforcement.
So Alan, do you think there should be training in social work for all or many police officers?
Yes, because a lot of calls that you go to are not murders. They're not, a lot of time may not even be a burglary. It may be a disturbance. A lot of officers, when you arrive at a call, are mostly disturbances. And how do you handle that in a professional manner? And you mentioned de-escalation. One of the big things that it mentions in the first film that I ever did with the history of Black police officers, all of those guys talked about communicating and making sure they had relationships in the community where they can use the escalation because they did not want things to blow out of proportion.
One of our questions sort of goes to this area. There's a question, what is the situation with police academies in the metro area? How many are there? Does all the hiring come out of those academies?
Currently, right now, St. Louis City is one of your few academies that you will be hired and we will actually pay you while you're in the academy. St. Louis County is more of a multi-municipality type of academy. So where we have just our St. Louis City component, they have more multi-jurisdictions. So they have more of a board. So if you get hired on with, say, Normandy PD, they'll put you through the academy. So you'll be in that class with people that's going to Normandy Police Department. You may be in there with someone that's going to the St. Louis Airport Police Department. But St. Louis City is primarily anyone that comes in and graduates works for the city of St. Louis. And coming from the academy, because again, I didn't put everything in my bio, but I taught at the academy. And to what Alan was saying, I taught patrol. And in patrol, I would stress a 90-10 rule. And what officers sometimes forget is that we deal with 10% of the population 90% of the time. And when I say the 10%, that's the 10% that's actually, breaking the law. And we only deal with 90% of the population 10% of the time. And that's the 90% that goes to work that, and I try to stress, hey, we have to talk to our citizens. Mm-hmm. If we build the gap between our citizens, when we build that relationship, then sometimes we can combat some of the crime we have out here because the community will have a trust in us to do the job and do it correctly. And Alan was hitting it right on the head that even with the community service component, I feel, and this is again just me coming from a training standpoint, that it wouldn't be a bad idea to put community service hours into the academy. It's right now you have to have about 1,200 hours to graduate from the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. 600 of those hours are post-mandated hours. The other 600 is our department hours. You have Jefferson County has a academy. You have several community colleges throughout the state of Missouri that have academies. and not real sure how their curriculum works. But our curriculum, we try to strive on just the communication part. And when I, again, getting back into the de-escalation, now I'm saying, we got back to it's how we talk to people. And I believe if we included that mandated community service hours and they actually got into the community, and I'm not saying community service in some of our well-to-do areas, but I'm saying the entire city. It's 61 square miles, 72 neighborhoods. So within that 61 square miles and those 72 neighborhoods, I feel you can get to know at least, a small portion of the 300,000 citizens that we have in the city.
One of our questions, I think, sort of takes off from this area of, communicating with the community, the social work component. The question is, isn't this the whole point of defunding the police? Police are answering calls that are not law related. There needs to be clarification, and it's not all about money.
Want me to jump in there on that one?
Sure.
Who wants to take that one?
Jump right in.
I was looking at that component of it too, because there's many different facets of the police department from St. Louis County to St. Louis City. And there's many different crimes and elements that do happen in all of that, and many different trainings. You got the tactical units, you got patrol, you got the horse mounted. You have many different patrols. And they're all quality positions and controls. And then we've been talking about that. So if you're talking about defunding anything, and I was on the budget for a while and appropriations with the state, and I'm always looking at that. And right now I'm looking at some other stuff right now too on closing prisons. Where do you take the money from? That is the question when you're talking about defunding anything or moving money from one place to another. These are key quality questions that need to be addressed, because again, if we're going to put more social workers out on the street, which may be a possibility, something that we have to look at, where does the money come from, and what and how are they going to be utilized? That is a key component of when you're looking at any particular reshaping of any budget, period. Another thing that what you're talking about too is you do have a lot of military guys that have gone into this profession. And you have to realize that their background is Marines, Air Force, Army, all of that and more. So they come in with that mentality, and they do not come in with the mentality of social work. Now, if I'm picking on anybody, forgive me, but I'm just had to go there right now, because I see a lot of that hardness, because that is what the military teaches. I just be factual about all of that. And so they don't come in with, I want to help. That's not the mentality that many of the guys come in with. That's not. It's a proactive military, assuming military. That's what the police department is in the first place. And Donnie, you can jump in anytime you want, because I don't want to take all of this, but since you're still in the police department, I can sort of shake the tree a little bit, okay?
Yeah, and you're right. Being in recruiting and seeing that, I can honestly say, being in recruiting, I get asked the question quite often, are the numbers down? And I say no, the numbers are actually up. Numbers, individuals on a daily, I'm seeing and talking to at least 10 people a day trying to become police officers, trying to make a difference. Our military component, I'm prior military as well, and you're right, it's just learning to disconnect. Again, coming from the military into the academy, especially when we get we get those from the military that they come out and then they go straight into the academy. So it's like they're going right back in the basic. They've never really been given that disconnect. Then after they get out the academy, they're right back in a uniform. They're right back into a set, unset, kind of back into a structure. And they, get used to that. And Alan, you hit it right on the head again, is that, they never really get that social work or the understanding, I should say, of community work. Maybe if we didn't say social work and say community work, and get the understanding of what's entailed with community work. It's more than, sometimes just stopping the car and getting out and walking the beat. We don't have that anymore. And
Right.
I get the times are different. I really do. I understand that. And safety is paramount in anybody in a uniform. But if some kids are playing, we can, stop and acknowledge them.
Here's a specific question. What has the Jeff Rorta-led organization stated or done to support African-American officers abused by their white colleagues in the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department? I refer specifically to the undercover officer abused/beaten during the kettling incident downtown a few years ago. I think we're talking about maybe the Luther Hall situation.
Yes. On situations like that, I've never really heard nothing public from him, especially pertaining to those that were of African American descent on this department that have received, that have been pretty much just abused and beaten. So I've never heard anything publicly said. Now, there may be some behind the scenes things said, but never anything public.
Here's a question. Are applicants required to undergo a psychological exam as part of the hiring process?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yes, they are.
Yes.
Now, to give you an actual input of what that psychological evaluation is, I do not know.
It's about 7 or 8 different steps that one has to take to qualify to move on to be a police officer. It's not just fill out an application, get interviewed. There are many, many different steps that one has to qualify to become an officer.
Yes, and to piggyback off of that, our procedures is once they've filled out the application, they'll take a physical abilities test. After the physical abilities test, then they'll take a aptitude battery test, which is kind of like a reading comprehension, multiple choice. They'll do an oral interview with a panel of selected detectives and police officers from the department. Once they've completed all 3 components, they get a composite score, which then would move them on to the background phase. During the background phase, it's the check of all the references, addresses, job history. If they complete all of that, then they'll move on to the selection process where they may be in a group where they will then go into the psychological evaluation portion of the final step before making it into the actual academy.
Here's a
Let me
question.
jump in on that one.
Go ahead.
If we have time. St. Louis County, I had the opportunity to work on a special project with them where we were trying to recruit more African Americans within the St. Louis County Police Department. So under Chief Belmar, and that was an excellent opportunity, and some of the lieutenant colonels. So we filled up a gym for a 2-day operation, and we invited people from the community to come in. Specifically, we're looking for African American males and females and minorities. And the gym was just packed. Standing room only, we had people in the stands, standing on the sidelines. And in 2 days, we did the entire process. They did the agility test, they took the exams, they did everything in 2 days. I mean, they did everything. We had all the police officers there, they had the classrooms available. We did everything, which I was very proud to see that. The only part of that is that we should have pre-examine or pre-test everyone before they got there, because a lot of them did not pass the test. That was my fault. I'll take that. But going back to the police department and the resources, they were more than welcome, saying that we want more minority officers on the police department. And I noticed through the Ethical Society they are training officers on the weekends to prepare for the test. And Donnie, you can jump in anytime you want because that's your
I would
area.
go into
But
that,
I
and I'm
follow
glad
you
you
all.
brought that
I
up.
follow you all closely with that.
And what he's referring to is what we call our pre-recruitment program, which I'm coordinator of that. So I wear many hats. I try to stay humble as I possibly can. And the pre-recruitment program, it's a 10-week course where they come in on their own twice a week, and we give them instructions over things that they would encounter in the academy. Plus, I've added the component to prepare them for the physical abilities test, the oral interview. We actually will do an oral interview with them to get them used to speaking in front of others. And we ask them some panel type questions and ask them to expound on them, getting them used to giving complete answers, sitting up properly, sitting up straight. I've also had our exercise physiology. She comes in at the beginning of the course and kind of does a pre-screening workout with some of our applicants so that they are able to prepare for the next 10 weeks for the PAT test, as well as beyond that, because I look beyond that. It is also the individuals that assist me or members of the Ethics Society, and eventually they become mentors. So from this program, we've had pretty much everyone from our program that have applied for the Metropolitan Police Department have gotten on. And we're still striving to grow the program. It is in a partnership. We utilize the Urban Leagues building in the city. Like I said, pretty much I am coordinator of that right now. Due to COVID, we were midways through a class.
Here's a question. Do St. Louis police officers have continuing education requirements?
Yes, we do. And it's pretty much mandated by the state. So it would be various, they have to have, now I believe it's 24 hours over the course of like 3 years in various, under legal, you got to have so many hours, interpersonal, as well as the technical skills. A lot of my de-escalation classes fall under interpersonal.
And a related question, many nations have longer training for police officers, a year or more. Do you think we rush the process in this country?
I've been asked that question outside of the panel, and I've been given, though I've actually researched a lot of the different other countries that do have the longer process. And here's what I say to that. The process, it can be longer depending on the determination of the person to actually get on. They can mask whatever personal feelings they may have towards a community for as long as it takes for them to reach the goal of getting on to a department.
Here's a question. Do you think all the separate municipal police departments contribute to the problems of enforcing the same training, decertification, even general ethics? When the city of St. Louis makes a policy decision, how does that trickle down to the individual municipalities?
Each municipality is different.
Right.
Each municipality have different rules. Their appointment process is different. Their chiefs are different. Roger pointed it out. I remember some years ago, and Roger could probably expound on it, when the St. Louis Post-Dispatch talked about some of the municipalities where they had officers who were quote unquote reserve officers utilizing their full-time officers, DSNs, to write tickets.
Yeah, let me jump in, Bill, if I may.
Sure.
And it relates to another question that you asked about how do we compare to other countries? And it gets to, we have 18,000, that's the latest figure, departments around the country. If you look at England, France, most Western democracies, they think we're crazy. having all those departments. They're much more centralized. The education requirements are higher. And it then leads into Donnie's last point, which is the quality of, and by the way, we have many departments in this state with one person. The average size nationwide of our 18,000 departments is 10 sworn officers or fewer. And so it's not so much the smallness of it, but what kind of financial backing can you give? What kind of salaries can you give? So there's no accident that officers going to St. Anne's probably couldn't get a job at any other place. So I think my work for years has been on decertifying individual officers. I think we've got to turn to, I don't know how we do it, decertifying departments. Just as if school districts can be disaccredited if they're not performing, we need to figure out a way to do that with departments that are failing our citizens.
Question for you, going back to just the statement, and I know there are a lot of questions to be answered. I looked at that many years ago, and also the fire. We have many different fire departments. That is a huge question that has to be probably put on a ballot or something like that, because you have these kingdoms of municipalities. I call them kingdoms, where you had 92 or 91 municipalities, and then you have various police departments, and they all like to have that, their service, you know, their chief, their patrolman. And so that is a tough question in itself, and an answer too.
Here's a question. What are the pros and cons of the residency requirement for the St. Louis Police Department?
I want to take that too. You go ahead.
It is honest, truly, the residency rule, it really should just be gone. Okay, we're not making we couldn't grow so much. We lose officers due to the residency rule, and that's both. I mean, that's both black and white. You'll get an officer that comes in at 22, 23 years old. Okay, he doesn't have a family, you know, and then here at 25, 26, he gets a family. He gets married. He starts having kids. And let's be honest, our public school system is not the best. And they want to go somewhere, and it's like we don't make a lot of money as law enforcement. The residency rule for the police department in St. Louis City is just, it should not be. You should be able to live wherever you want to live. Working, and we see now, okay, every officer lives in the city. That does not improve the quality of police officers just because they live in the city. Live in the city. That does not improve the quality that we're going to get. I mean, we get a lot of people that live in the city that want to work for the city, but right now we're almost like a training ground. They'll come here, they'll get the experience. 3 years later, they're gone. They're gone, and they're going to those various departments that Roger was talking about with the larger budgets. They're at Chesterfield. They're going to Ladue. They're going to go to Town and Country. Notice that they're going to the larger departments because they have the budget, and those larger departments will pay them because they've got city training. And then it's kind of Roger can expound on this a lot better, is that we got some departments that you go to when you're in trouble, and you got the other departments you go to when you want to make the money.
And there's a word for those departments, Donnie: last chance agencies.
And they can bounce between 4 to 5, maybe. We got 91. I could probably name roughly 10 agencies that they can bounce through. Yeah. You know, and if you figure if they do 2 years at those 10, that's 20 years of law enforcement.
But two of these questions, I got two questions to put together. One person says, we keep talking about police, but not policing. How does policing need to change regardless of what the police look like? And then another question sort of related. Alan mentioned the community's demand to defund the police. And he asked, where would the money come from to fund more social workers? If we defund the police, money that would have gone towards them would go towards social workers or other community workers. Would Alan support something like this. Adding on to that, the police department in theory is here to support the community, and if the community is asking for defunding of the police, would Alan or Donnie support it?
Let me jump in because I want to address that, because when I left the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, I went into social work and I was very successful. Matter of fact, I did the model that drug courts come out of under Joseph Califano. I was part of that team out of Columbia University right after I left the police department, part of that think tank. So I had the pleasure of making that switch into social work and was very successful in doing that. But here's the but part. Even that had its money cut by the federal government. So again, when you're always looking at budgets, where is the money going to come from, period? And yes, you can switch within the departments, but you still have homicides, you still have traffic, you still have all these things and burglaries that still have to be handled out there on the streets. So what are you going to pull that money from? I always tell people when you're looking at a budget, yeah, you could take it from here and you put it over there, but you took money away from something that was being funded already. So do you want to give up homicide? You want to give it up? Okay, we let the murderers run free. We're going to give up homicide. We're going to put it over here. Or now when a burglary happened, no. There's no officers that's going to handle a burglary because you're going to take that money and you're going to move it over here. Oh man, that was a traffic accident and someone got killed in traffic. No, you don't have no traffic officers because you took that money and you put it over here. There is no free lunch. There is no free money.
One of the persons asking a question makes the comment, not everyone wants to defund the police, only a small vocal liberal minority. I'm very grateful for the police and thank them. And then somebody else says, come on, the murder clear rate is terrible and he knows it.
As far as and Alan, like I said, has more knowledge on than I do with as far as budgets. But as far as policing is like anything. We have to evolve, and I really like the part where Alan did the opening and talked about that was an evolution. We've evolved from just wearing a suit and saying we're the police with no gun to actually saying, hey, I'm a sergeant of police with the same, with whatever department in the country, if not the United States. And with that being said, policing, we have to evolve. It's about evolution. It's as crimes are being, and criminals go to jail and they go in for one thing. And most of them come out with a different skill and a different knowledge set, those that stay criminal minded. I'm not saying all, but it's some that will go in and they come out and learn a new trade. And that's an evolution. And we in law enforcement have to learn how to evolve with time. Right now, protesters and protest groups are here. And we need to acknowledge that, hey, there's a difference between protesters and rioters. There's a big difference. And we need to acknowledge that difference. Not everyone protesting is rioting.
True.
Not everyone that is exercising their constitutional rights are criminals. Not everyone that is speaking through a megaphone is asking or saying destroy anything. So we need to separate those two. That's part of policing.
Here's a question. I appreciate we're speaking more about having more Black and brown police officers, but everything I've seen, more Black officers doesn't reduce the killing of Black citizens until possibly when Black officers make up more than 40% of the force. Before that point, more Black officers might actually increase the amount of Black citizens killed by police. Is the point of hiring more Black officers for diversity and inclusion or to reduce the killing of Black Americans?
Well, looking at the numbers right there, and if you ever going back to the original movie that I produced, the officers that were in that original movie talked about getting out into the community and building relationships, which is what we're calling 2020 community policing, because there's relationships that are built, whereas there's a trust and how to solve these crimes. there is right now an element out there when we're talking about the crimes, murders, and all the stuff that's happening in the African American community, where there's a total distrust of the police. It just put it on the table. You do have some officers that, again, bend the line, but there are a lot of good officers too. I have to put that on the table. But in the African American community, there's distrust. And when I was there was distrust. And I have 3 sons that are police officers now, and I hear a lot of that right now. And I have sons that are police officers. So we have to do a better job of working in the African American community, or minority community, period. And that is a trust element that has gone back and forth. And also that is addressed in the movie Of Black and Blue, because when you're an African American police officer, you get shunned on the police department, but you also shunned in the community. So you're caught right there in the middle. So who do you get an opportunity to talk to about these problems? You know, you can't go talk to the other police officers because some of them don't understand. You can't go home and talk about some of these problems because they don't understand. So you're caught right in the middle.
One person asks, is St. Louis looking at Portland, Oregon? They implemented alternative divisions to answer non-law calls, like social work. So isn't the unfortunate answer from a budget perspective that Alan referred to replace some police officers with more social and environmental workers who are trained?
I believe with the, I know the stance with the Ethical Society, and we have discussed that, yes, we really should have some calls directed towards so it's the social worker aspect of it, because sometimes there are calls for, hey, we get calls sometimes when parents say their kids don't want to go to school. We get those type of calls here in the city. We get calls where someone is pretty much having a mental crisis. And again, yes, we are CIT trained. However, that's not a criminal offense if the person is nonviolent. And at those type of calls, I believe, yes, social workers will come in a lot more and help with getting them the services that they need, through behavioral health and the other agencies and within the city limits and county. I'm sorry, city limits and county.
Let me address that. In 1998, when I had the opportunity to go into a Buzz Westfall administration, we tried to address that social work piece with creating neighborhood preservation. And we put the police officers with public work inspectors. So when they go in the house and you see a lot of hoarding of materials and maybe sometimes mental illness, you have the public works inspector that's inspecting the house, but then sometimes the police officer needs to get on the phone and say, okay, we need to get some social workers and social service agencies over here in this house to help get this family back on their feet. That program has been around since 1998, neighborhood preservation, proud to say that, because at first when we tried, and we did do that, the officers a lot of them didn't want to be called social workers, but now a lot of those officers are proud to say that they have helped thousands and thousands of people. And so I'm proud to say that is a piece that we need to look at, is how do we get people into these households and communities, whereas we're not arresting people, but we're solving problems.
Here's another question. It seems the root of a lot of the issues is the problem of lethal armament and the fact that so many police situations are changed by the appearance of lethal weapons on the part of the police. So many incidents require responses that are impeded by the appearance of lethal force. So when we talk about defunding police, we're talking about fewer personnel with lethal force and more with other kinds of skills and equipment. Overall, there needs to be fewer officers. Overall, there need not be fewer officers. Just less weapons, fewer weapons, lethal weapons. What do you think of that?
With the stance with here recently with the changing of the conceal and carry law, and let's be perfectly honest, on behalf of the city of St. Louis County, and Kansas City PD, those residents weren't the deciding factor in changing the conceal and carry law. We got to look at, it came from our rural areas. It came from those areas that they allow their kids to hunt without parent supervision. They allow their kids to use weapons without supervision. So when we now, with the changing of the conceal and carry law, there's more individuals out here with higher power rifles and arms than the police department.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we're taking guns off the street that don't always make the news, where individuals will have a modified pistol with an extended magazine, and with that magazine holding 30 plus rounds, opposed to a law enforcement officer with a magazine only holding 17 rounds. So taking the arms from police officers and trying to put them on the street as quote unquote bobbies, which is what London has. And I've talked to London police officers, if they have a person with a weapon, they have to seek shelter and call, they have to call their TAC team out.
Right.
And the TAC team out is coming out with automatic. So
I got one more question I want to try to get in. It seems that when you're talking about police coming from the military, you're suggesting a military background shapes police to see citizens as enemies, and this shapes police culture. But if the police never hired another ex-military, wouldn't the police still have a thin blue line culture problem? Wouldn't police still have a culture based in white supremacy and male domination?
Well, let me jump on that one real quick. I have two sons that came out of the military, one out of the Army, one out of the Marines, and they're both police officers. And they're striving, of course, to move their careers further. And they have families. And one of the things is when we're talking about the culture shift, when we're looking at, how many officers on the St. Louis Police Department compared to the minority officers, compared to the white officers. That's something that had always puzzled me, why that number is so skewed. That number is really, really skewed. But in St. Louis County, that number is skewed too. And that's just the way it is. We need to address some of those issues. We do. And we need to look at how do we get more of our police department to look more like our neighborhoods. That is a tough question in itself. And when we're talking about now the training piece, we do need more training. But I think overall, it's 2020, and we do have to look at different models of how we move forward. And that's why we're having this discussion.
My viewpoint, I'm not saying that those that come out the military see citizens as enemies. I never would say that. They just come out with a different structure and a different structured base that sometimes it is, they see, because, if you take I remember my uncle when he came home from the military, and it took him almost a year to get, his barking orders out of his voice. So when you've been programmed, let me say that, when you have been in an environment for so long where it's structured like that, sometimes it's hard to break free and go back to, normal or the civilian way of living. You got certain things. Alan's son says he's a Marine. Once a Marine, always Marine. That's their motto. And sometimes you take pride in that. Being in the Army, hey, I was in the Army, and it took me almost a year after getting out the Army to really not fold and roll my socks. So it's just when you come out the military and you go into law enforcement, some of those officers that come out the military, they need a job. And what's the first ones to hire them is law enforcement, because they see, oh, he's been here for 4 years, steady employment. And if he's an honorable discharged, then it's like, hey, it's an easy transition. So, but I do not think they see citizens as the enemy. No, I don't.
No.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you so much. Bill, you really kept the conversation going. I am just going to ask each of you really quickly, do you have any final thoughts? Is there anything that we were unable to get to that you want to just quickly mention before we close out the program?
Shakia, I had one comment to make.
Yes, sir.
And it is a bit academic, but there's a lot of discussion on what should we be looking for in terms of a recruit for the police. And the verbiage that's now being used, should we have a warrior or a guardian? Just check that out. There's a lot of discussion of that. I'm sure Donnie's aware of it.
Yes.
And I think that kind of summarizes a lot of things that we said tonight.
Thank you.
I just
Bill.
want to say,
Oh,
Ira Cooper was the gentleman in the picture with the tan cap and light-skinned to the far left.
Wait, let me go back. Okay. Here? Oh, here?
Ira Cooper on the first row in the suit, yes. The light cap and light-skinned gentleman right there. That's Ira Cooper.
Okay, thank you. That was one of our earlier questions. Thank you, Alan. Donnie, final thoughts?
I'm just glad that, you know, I was able to represent the Ethical Society of Police and being a part of this. And Roger was saying, are we training warriors or guardians? When I was in the academy, I felt that I was training people to be police officers. That was always my thought process, my feelings. And when I look for officers, future officers, I look for good people to be police officers.
Okay. And Bill, our moderator for the evening, any final thoughts? Pull it all together for us.
Well, I've never seen a time in my 50 years as a reporter covering these issues where there has been so much national attention on the issues of police accountability, and particularly as it relates to African-American citizens. And I think that presents an opportunity for making changes that we haven't been able to make before.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to our guest panelists, William Freivogel, Alan K. Green, Roger Goldman, and Donnell Walters for sharing your time and expertise with us this evening. During the discussion, well, as you can see on the screen, we have an uncensored community conversation. If you would like to participate, you can grab the link that should be available in the chat, and we would love to have you. We would love to continue this conversation and start our racial caucusing groups. If you are also interested in supporting MHS through a membership, we would be so grateful to have your support. Please copy the link and paste it into your browser. Also, at the start of this program, a Kobo toolbox should have opened with a survey. We would love for you to fill out the survey and tell us what you think about the program. And lastly, if you enjoyed this program, come back same time next Tuesday where we will join Dr. John Wright as we talk about the history of St. Louis Black neighborhoods. And then on the 4th, a conversation with Michelle Duster. She is the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, and we'll talk about today's street journalist. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope that you will participate in the community conversation. It is going to be an excellent time, and you'll just stick around for another 30 minutes so we can continue to talk. But thank you again to our panelists. You all were awesome. I hope everyone learned a great deal tonight, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of the questions, but we got to a lot of them. So again, thank you for your participation, and thank you to everyone that viewed the program this evening. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
We're just giving our attendees a few moments to grab the link that's in the chat box. If you'd like to join us for the community conversation, please be sure to grab the link before we end the program. I'll end it in about 2 minutes. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you over in the community conversation.